Well, good afternoon and a very warm virtual welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science for the launch of this report, Interfaith Beyond the Pandemic, from London communities to global identities. This report is the fruit of the first project undertaken by the new Religion and Global Society Research Unit at the LSE. That unit is a partnership between different academic partners, academic departments, but it's housed in the Faith Centre, which has been running programs to promote religious literacy and interfaith leadership amongst our student body at LSE since 2014. As I've set up and developed that centre over the years, I've benefited enormously from the wisdom and support of individuals and organisations in the wider UK interfaith sector. And I think we can be certain that the interfaith networks and infrastructure in this country are among the most developed of any country in the world. London in particular has a strong religious civil society and long-established relationships across communities, from informal partnerships between places of worship to the more formal, even statutory presence of sacres, supporting local authorities in RE, and different kinds of faith leaders forums. So I found being part of that sector very beneficial, but I've also been aware that we've been doing something quite distinctive too. We're one of the few interfaith organisations working almost exclusively with young people, with all the new perspectives that young people bring on faith, identity, community, and social engagement. And then because of the nature of our university, we're also drawing those young people from all around the world, and therefore from literally every major faith tradition. And what we have found really interesting about the COVID-19 pandemic is that it has highlighted some tensions or challenges within the contemporary interfaith scene that we have been experiencing and wrestling with as a centre for some time. So in February 2020, we were awarded a grant from the LSE Knowledge Exchange and Impact Fund to conduct some research into how interreligious cooperation in London might be strengthened. And of course, we had no idea at that point that a global pandemic was going to be any sort of consideration. But what we have found is that in addition to reshaping how we've had to conduct the research, it has also created conditions and necessitated actions which have really drawn to the fore some issues which we've been encountering for some time and which I think the whole interfaith sector is now having to respond to. Broadly speaking, we frame those issues in the report around three pivotal tensions. The first, a tension between traditional authority figures who may still be the people who leverage most power within faith communities, and the representation of a much more fluid religious scene, where religious institutions are themselves evolving and where many people of faith may choose to sit outside of those institutions. And that tension's been experienced in the formation of the interfaith bodies needed to address the public health challenges of the pandemic. The second is an intergenerational tension that's emerged around the mode of interfaith, whether it takes the form of dialogue or social action. And again, that's been accelerated by some empowerment of young people during the pandemic and the move online that COVID has necessitated, and the need to address the social problems that the pandemic has created. And then third is an increasing tension across faith groups between religious identities formed within local communities and identity formed at a more global level. And those global identities are often more oppositional in character and less conducive to positive interfaith encounter. Again, that's been accelerated by the migration online and the ability of believers of all stripes to participate in worship and discourses of faith with co-religionists all around the world. And the local's often been weakened as people have been less able to interact in person. As we were writing up our research, this last point has been illustrated in very painful ways as the Israel-Palestine conflict flared up once again. And I know that's been very difficult and very damaging for many interfaith organisations in London and beyond. It certainly has been for us. In terms of public health, the pandemic has taught us that we can't insulate ourselves in the UK from this virus. And the way our society is ordered in terms of leadership, equality, and citizenship affects how well we deal with it. And I think we can see that interfaith tensions are the same. We can't stop them being imported into our communities here in London, but how we organise ourselves and how we engage with one another will shape how well we can respond to them and suppress them. So I very much hope that our findings and reflections on these three areas are going to be very relevant and useful for policymakers and activists across our sector. Nothing in the report is intended as criticism of anybody's way of doing things, but simply an invitation to share in wrestling with what we are wrestling with, in the hope that we can make our already strong interfaith sector more effective, more representative, and more ready to address the escalating challenges of religion-related conflict. So as I say, I've received a great deal from the UK interfaith sector, and I hope that this report might be something that we can give back in order to help all of us learn and develop. In that spirit, we want to allow plenty of time for discussion later on in this event. And to open that up, I'm delighted that we are going to have a response to the report from Dr. Disha Chadha, who is a council member at the Faith Forum for London. But first, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, Dr. Manmit Bambra and Dr. Austin Tiffany, to say a little bit more about the research, the findings, and our recommendations. So Manmit, over to you.
Thank you, Jim, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the launch of our inaugural research project, Interfaith Beyond the Pandemic, London Communities to Global Identities. For those of you I've not met before, I'm Manmit Bambra, and I've been leading this project for the last year, examining interfaith in London. And I'm now very happy to share with you some of our key findings from our research. Okay, for this, our presentation, I'll be focusing on outlining our research methodology and telling you a little bit more about what we did to gather the data that we've used to form the basis of our conclusions in this piece of work. And the three key areas that I will be focusing on are the politics of representation, social action, and what we've called navigating the global and the local. And these three chapters are the key thematic concerns, the key themes that emerged as we conducted and analysed our data. Austin will then move on to the conclusions and recommendations. So in terms of our research methodology, really the aim of this research was to investigate a range of perceptions and experiences and to explore individual biography, as well as trying to create and maintain a diverse sample throughout this work. So although we have utilised some of our networks at the LSE and some of our Faith Centre alumni networks, we did snowball out of that. And so we have been able to speak to a range of young people from different backgrounds and different denominations. Our methodology was fourfold. We did qualitative interviews with young people from different faith communities, 31 of those, and they were balanced in terms of gender. We did qualitative interviews with faith leaders and stakeholders, 8 of those. And we also conducted an online survey which had a response rate of 100 full responses, as well as hosting an intergenerational youth conference in January of this year. The first key finding that I want to talk about is this idea of the politics of representation. And we found that representation continues to be a challenge in the interfaith sector. And as one of our interviewees put it, not everyone can always have a seat and a voice at the table. But despite there being a real commitment to achieving representation and inclusivity, we do find that there are frequent tensions between the pragmatic approach of bringing people together, who are often those with most authority and older men, with the benefits of broader inclusivity. We've seen this tension recently with the pandemic, which necessitated the creation of interfaith forums and initiatives by the state. This case study highlights this key debate in the sector around pragmatism versus inclusivity. This attempt to actively engage faith communities during COVID was seen by many of our respondents as a positive move, but the pragmatic aims and urgent creation of this task force created tensions around who was included and who ended up representing each group. The case study of the task force provides a useful illustration of the challenges of representation in state-led interfaith, balancing effective pragmatism with concern for inclusivity in communities with divergent structures of authority which could be better understood. We believe that in seeking to appoint a representative, the government and other external bodies must acknowledge the structural and organisational differences amongst different faith communities. The second part of this finding around the politics of representation is really about how the move online has democratised leadership for young people and young women in particular. We found in the process of our research that within religious communities and interfaith more broadly, representation of young people continues to be an issue for concern. Indeed, many of the young people that we spoke to felt that they could never be leaders within their own religious communities or structures. Yet young people retain strong religious identities. Their faith is important to them. However, as our data shows, they now channel that activity and that enthusiasm through educational and community-focused organisations and more inclusive interfaith forums such as Limud, Rumi's Cave and City 6, and these are all examples that were frequent in our data collection. The representation of women in all forms of interfaith was a common thematic concern throughout our data, but there was a particular emphasis on the exclusion of young women. Many felt that they are not eligible for leadership within their faith communities and as a result are less likely to be nominated for state-led or formal civil society interfaith forums. However, as discussed, the rise of online informal interfaith gatherings has created a more democratic space where they can freely assume responsibilities. Overall, we find that the move online, accelerated during the pandemic, has been democratising for young people and young women in particular. This extension of religious space to women through online accessibility has, we believe, great potential to bolster the credibility and authority of women's voices within their own communities and the interfaith sector. Something that we think is important to highlight is many young people that we spoke about, they did feel that being involved in interfaith provided them with opportunities for representation. It seems that interfaith and involvement with interfaith encounter and activities is a way that young people can seek out a sense of belonging which may be absent for them in other parts of their lives, as this quote exemplifies. The second key finding in our data collection is that of social action. Throughout the pandemic, our research has found that the move online has propelled social action to the forefront of the interfaith agenda through the growth of new informal interfaith organisations. And these informal interfaith organisations are largely due to the initiative and interests of young people. Furthermore, interfaith social action was a recurring theme at our youth conference. And we found overall in all streams of our data collection that young people are more likely to see interfaith collaboration as a vehicle for social action rather than dialogue, which is reflective of young people's understandings of faith as defined more broadly by action. This, however, has seemingly contributed to a troubling intergenerational divide within the sector. We find that the rise of online platforms as a dominant communication interface has enabled young people to create informal civil society forums that value inclusivity and reflect the priorities of young people. What it's also done is allowed young people to focus on areas that they are passionate about, that they're worried about in their everyday lives, namely social action and particularly issues around justice. This shift towards action does not necessarily spell the end of youth involvement in other forms of interfaith. This word cloud summarises data from our youth conference, and it shows clearly that young people do value dialogue, but that interfaith also encompasses other areas such as solidarity and organisational purpose for them. Our research overall finds that there is no appetite amongst young people to entirely separate themselves from traditional interfaith structures. Yet instead there is a strong desire for those structures to in fact become more inclusive, become more welcoming, not only of young women and young people, but of smaller faiths, and also that young people's ideas around social action and justice. Ultimately, we believe that a form of interfaith that values social action and intergenerational involvement marks the way forward. Thirdly, we turn to now navigating the global and the local. This project has sought to examine how interfaith works in London, but this has inescapably involved uncovering how religious identities are being shaped by events overseas and the extent to which this impacts at the local level. We do see that young people are increasingly embedded in virtual spaces and that their exposure to global events may shape their perceptions in a unique way. We also have investigated how religious-based tensions that occur globally may impact how local communities and individuals interact and understand one another in the diverse setting of London. There are three key ways that we believe that the global impacts the local. Firstly is through belonging and identity. Secondly, through imported tensions. And thirdly, by highlighting the importance of personal contacts. The connection between the global and the local, as these graphs show, the connection between the global and the local is shaping identity formation and how religious identities are lived and conceptualized for many young people. As we can see, many young people feel strongly that they have solidarity with other members of their faith overseas than they do with those of other faiths here in the UK. Further analysis of this data from our survey, when broken down by religious group, showed actually that Christians and Jews are the two groups who feel a sense of global religious community most acutely. 54% of young Christians and 54% of young Jews surveyed agreed strongly that they feel more solidarity with other members of their faith abroad than those of other faiths in the UK. And this is compared with 35% of young Muslims. This is an interesting finding, which perhaps challenges the often essentializing assumptions around the identity orientations and social integration of young British Muslims, as well as conveying the salience of a global religious community among other faith groups. The second way that the global can impact the local is through the way that it can mean that young people can import tensions. The escalating tensions between Hindu, Sikhs and Muslims in India under the current Modi administration is something that our British Indian and British Pakistani interviewees often reflected on in our discussions, and this quote exemplifies that. What we can see is that interconnectedness can bring young people together. It can mean that they can organise themselves and promote areas around social action and justice that they care about. But there is another side to this. There is a danger that what is happening around the world can quickly be imported into the local setting, where these tensions can be reproduced. As a result, the work of bringing people together at all levels of interfaith may quickly become destabilised and or threatened in this process. One finding that was very salient across all of our data sets was the importance of personal contact. Across our interviews and survey data sets, we found a common sentiment of young people focusing on their personal interactions as key to shaping their feelings about other groups. When these young people learned about global tensions, they were emotionally impacted by them, but they reflected on their personal positive relationships and interactions from people from other faith communities and endeavoured to separate these from these global events. Our data thus highlights the importance of diverse personal contacts, interactions and relationships, and these were emphasised throughout our research by these young people. They emphasised that they did not want to let global events impact how they felt about other groups. In the growing challenge of imported tensions, interfaith dialogue and understanding can equip young people with the ability to maintain positive relationships with other faiths in the face of conflict. Lastly, the diversity and social contact in London. To conclude, global events can and do shape young people's feelings towards other groups. However, they are genuinely committed to not letting these feelings impact how they relate to those other groups in their local setting. Encouragingly, our data indicates that on a whole, being a Londoner positively impacts the way that global tensions are felt at the local level. The high levels of diversity and intergroup social contact that young people experience in London has shaped their social networks and their ability to keep global tensions outside of their diverse relationships with members of other communities, even if they are impacted, angered, or worried by them. I'll now hand over to Austin for the recommendations.
Hi, everyone. From my time zone, good morning. It's really great to be with you all. I am currently across the pond with family in the Rockies, so advance apologies if you hear playing children in the background or barking dogs. Hopefully it'll be fairly quiet. It is such a pleasure and an honor and opportunity to be here and to be sharing this work with you. And so I'm going to share the key findings and the recommendations, which you can find in full in the copy of the report. The first kind of key finding and recommendation is during the pandemic, the interfaith sector has diversified, and we've seen, moving from a largely formal civil society structure to one where new state-led and informal civil society networks are playing a prominent role. In addition to that, we really find that formal civil society, these kind of established interfaith structures, should be learning from the agility and the responsiveness of state-led interfaith displayed during the pandemic, while it should also note the flexibility and the entrepreneurialism of the informal civil society interfaith structures that we found in our research. However, we think that both the state-led and these informal structures should be learning from the wisdom of established formal interfaith organizations and take note of the long-term relationship building that these formal structures are known for. Within that specifically, we have found and recommend that the government should be building collaborative relationships with interfaith forums and with faith communities that go beyond the pandemic in times of crisis and take a longer term vision of this relationship. Within formal civil society, they need to be avoiding a club mentality that can limit participation, especially for women and young people, as Mehmet explained. And within informal civil society, despite their entrepreneurial tendencies and how creative they are in creating new programs, they do not need to reinvent the wheel of interfaith, and instead we want to encourage them to engage with and integrate with established structures. Our second key finding and recommendation is this tension between pragmatic and inclusive interfaith that Mehmet talked about, and that is incredibly difficult to resolve. Communities can be disadvantaged by individuals who are chosen for political or politically correct reasons, and attention should be paid to who holds authority within certain communities when they're acting in this representative capacity. To facilitate this, we believe that the government should review the representation and effectiveness of its COVID response of faith communities, especially for those who felt that they were left out of the consultations. And among interfaith organizations, especially those who are working in top-led kind of state-level interfaith forums, they should identify appropriate participants and curate important discussions about who is at the table and why they are there. Our third key finding and recommendation is that informal civil society has undoubtedly democratized interfaith. It has included more women and younger people and minority groups. Informal structures should proactively incorporate these new leaders and give opportunity to those who are often excluded from leadership roles. Furthermore, identifying and investing in spheres of activity where there are fewer theological and cultural barriers, such as social action, including many others, could foster more inclusion and diverse leadership within them. Our fourth key finding and recommendation is about social action specifically. As we've said, young people are using social action as a more engaging vehicle for interfaith work. Older leaders should champion this work and should collaborate with them in creating intergenerational projects that can provide community support. This was clearly seen during the pandemic and many examples that you can find throughout our report, and we think it's a very powerful finding and recommendation moving forward. And finally, our fifth key finding and recommendation is this move online during the pandemic has intensified the way that global religious discourse impacts local engagement, especially in regards to interreligious conflicts. We encourage interfaith forums to tackle these discussions, take audit of their resilience capacity in the aftermath of challenging global events. This is a very, very brief summary of our findings and our recommendations, but hopefully it's enough to give you a taste to open up discussion so we can discuss it further. And I'll hand it back over to Jim.
Thanks very much, Mehmet and Austin. Well, that's what we found, that's what we think, and we're very keen to see how that's received by people who are engaging with this stuff on the ground. So we're delighted that Disha has offered to give a brief response. She's someone who I consider to be a reflective practitioner in this area, so we really value what you have to say. Disha.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So firstly, I think that the work that you've actually done is really important because I don't think it's been done before. I think for a lot of the time, we've taken these structures and the way that interfaith and faith works for granted. This is just the way it is. This is the status quo. So to challenge it and to open it up and to say what is actually going on and is it working? Is it fit for purpose? These are important questions because faith leaders, they have a duty to perform. They speak to governance, they connect with their communities, and they need to be doing this the best way they can. Okay, so I thank you for actually doing the work in the first place, because I think it's implicit. It's never said, and there's just a lot of things that have been brought up here, with a lot of these ideas just cutting across one another as well, which I think is quite interesting because there's a lot to unpack within that as well. So I think the way that I can best summarize is to say what it is that worries me in what you found, and what is it that gives me hope in what it is that you found. So I think that I'm concerned that there is still there's still gatekeepers, and young people and women still can't access the places that they should be able to. So to be able to kind of like work through your faith and then to connect to others of faith is actually very, very important. And the fact that these doors are still closed and have been closed for as long as I can remember, I think is concerning. I know in my own journey I had to push hard to get to where I am. So that does concern me quite a lot, because it shows a lack of respect. It's like saying that I have an authority and you can't challenge it. So I think there is this idea that when people become religious leaders, because all of a sudden, they do connect to various other peoples because they are the people who sit at the tables, it then develops an ego within them. Okay, so that in itself needs to be challenged. I think people need to take those older religious leaders to task. And I think your report can actually help in doing that. Because what is useful about evidence is that it can then start changing things. So actually kind of saying to someone, look, this is what we found, what's going on in your institution? How do we change the setup here? Ask them to ask those questions of themselves, because that's really important. I think the other thing that kind of worries me a little bit within this is where we are with the dialogue amongst young people. So I know the older generation, they've championed dialogue for so long, mostly because people come from other parts of the world. It's taken them a while to understand what community looks like through faith interactions. So now that we're actually kind of like here and we're more assimilated into culture and society, we don't push as hard for dialogue. We don't push as hard to try and understand, who are you, what's your political understanding of a situation. And I think that can be detrimental when people don't start talking and communicating and trying to understand their relationships with one another. And that's one of the things that we're kind of seeing in this idea that, okay, something is happening hundreds of miles away and it's impacting what goes on in this country, in the capital and various other people in various other places. And we're actually a melting pot. It shouldn't be like this. We should be able to kind of live beyond that. So there's a dialogue that's missing, I think, within that. And I don't know what it actually looks like, but there is a dialogue that's missing here, I think. And then in terms of what it is that gives me hope, I think that young people have mobilized themselves. They've stopped waiting to be asked to do things, and they have so many resources around them. I think social media is a fantastic tool in that it just connects them to one another and connects them to other places and other people, and other groups as well. So they've started doing things for themselves by themselves, and it's not just like, okay, here's an idea, let's see what we can do with it. They go all the way from A to Z with things, and I've seen them do that. You know, when things were quite bad in India a while ago, 10 minutes later, they were sending out kind of oxygen tanks to India, so they can do things very, very quickly. What they don't have that goes along with that is the recognition. They don't have someone saying to them, yes, fantastic, job well done. And inadvertently, that takes the power away from them, like that takes the authority away from them. So I think one of your recommendations was actually quite useful, in that we should champion young people when they do things like this, when they step up and actually kind of like put themselves forward, because they don't have to. We should actually say, fantastic, and then we can now help you move this forward in some meaningful way. So that's something that actually does give me a lot of hope, and also the fact that they're willing to cut across religious divides as well, because they think about bigger issues. To a degree, I feel that they've been, pushed into that place because the climate situation we're in is going to hit them harder than anyone else. But they focus on the bigger problem, and that I think allows them to kind of like jump through a lot of other hurdles, things that are smaller and insignificant that, elder people might not think are so, but younger people are like, no, you know what? There's a bigger problem here. In order to solve that, we need to start pushing through everything else. And they're not afraid to do that. So they don't have that fear that I think the older generation had in that sense. And they also have tremendous role models who inspire them. So people like Marcus Rashford, Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, so on and so forth. And so I think there's a lot that is being done, in that space. And I think you've actually kind of like, started pulling this out, which I think is fantastic. So those are just the kind of things that I've kind of like, that for me kind of like spoke to me in the work that you've done. But as I said before, it's fantastic to have something there. And I really hope that you can build on it and ask more questions of the people who actually work in this space.
Disha, thank you so much for reflecting on the report in that way. And we want to take this conversation much further, and people have been sent a copy of the report. Today, we're going to look for other opportunities and fora in which we can present the findings, and it may well be that you and other people here can find those opportunities for us to share the conversation about this work. But we want to really open up that conversation now. We've got just over 20 minutes. So we're small in number, and I think it's a good opportunity for lots of voices to be heard. If you're very shy, you can put a question in the chat, but we'd really be delighted if you want to raise a virtual hand. I'm sure by now you go to the reactions icon, and raise hand function is just there. And do turn your camera on if you're able. And we'd really like to hear, there's been a lot in the presentation, there's even more in the report, but if anything that's been said is kind of resonating with you, we'd love to hear about that. Or if you've got any specific questions for us as authors, we will answer those as well. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. Really, really good to be here. And thanks for the report. I haven't had a chance to read it properly yet, but it looks really good, really useful. And partly I like it. It really builds on some of the stuff I did for my research, my PhD a few years ago. So it's nice to see some of the things that I thought I might have come across being confirmed by others who've done a much more robust, bigger piece of research. So thank you for that. That's brilliant. But really, really good stuff, and be good to use it. And I think it'll be a really helpful piece of work. So that's the first thing I want to say, just well done. It's really, really good. I think one of the interesting things, I think this thing about representation, I completely agree with the things that were said about broadening representation. I'm in danger of becoming one of the kind of old middle-aged men who hold places, and therefore how I kind of move myself out of the way is one of the questions on my mind all the time. And I realise I'm not doing that at the moment, so I'll shut up very quickly. But how we create the spaces for others to be involved. But I think it raises two, or at least two or three important questions. One is, again, in a sense, how big do you make the groups? So I work here in Birmingham. I'm always saying to folk, if you want to be fully representative of Birmingham, you need at least 300 people in the room. By the time you've got every religion, every gender, every sexuality, every age, whatever, that's unsustainable. So how do you balance the need to be as representative as possible with meetings that actually make sense with the numbers of people in the room? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's an ongoing question. And I think one of the challenges for or two perhaps challenges for the kind of the folk already embedded in this stuff like us is, are we willing to really be flexible? And that means times of day. Actually saying we're going to meet from 2 till 4, not this meeting, I mean in the kind of work that I do, is useless if you want young people to be there, particularly if they're at school or university, because they might be doing stuff or they might have jobs. So when are we going to meet? What day of the week are we going to meet? Is one of the things. And I think modelling the kind of dialogue this was referred to, I think, there is often still real deference in interfaith meetings, the like of which I don't meet in many other places in the world. And while I'm into being polite and friendly and not being rude about people, there is a deference that says, therefore, I won't critique or question you, even if what you've said I totally disagree with, or I find quite offensive or is outrageous, because you are old, you've got a title, whatever. And I think helping, and for some of us who are older, to model that way that we say we are prepared to challenge people who are in authority, to create that space for younger people who might not have that confidence to kind of be able to do that as well. Because I think deference can be a real block to kind of honest conversation. But those are just a couple of observations. But basically, thank you. Really good report.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm going to kick off a bit of a response and hand over to colleagues. I mean, the point you make about how we make space for others and in what settings, I think, is one that's really engaged us. And one of the most important recommendations, I think, is encouraging interfaith organizations to think about, to articulate their principles of engagement. What is this group of people getting together for? Because I've been on lots of different interfaith forums where it's all the same people, and it may not need to be. And, and quite often I think within communities, people say, oh, this is an interfaith thing, we send so-and-so. And what we need to start doing is thinking about sending more unlikely suspects to those things. So my classic example of this was when I chaired the SACRE in North London, which is the Standing Advisory Council on Religious Education. And there were lots of people there who were kind of interfaith people who'd see at all the other interfaith things. And actually, as chair, what I wanted was people who maybe weren't that interested in interfaith things, but knew a bit about schools and knew a bit about education policy. And we really tried to kind of look at the membership of that and get some new faces around the table who weren't just the usual suspects, but actually knew something and were kind of helpful. But colleagues, over to you.
One area that I really want to piggyback on to your comments, Andrew, is in terms of how do we kind of maintain, we include different people, we include different voices. What came out during our research is the utility of online gathering. And even though so many of us are so desperate to go back to in-person gathering and to meet face-to-face, and we recognize the power of that, a lot of our interviewees also recognized the how the online platform allowed us to engage and log into meetings that normally we would have never had access to. And so many young people say, we want to be back face-to-face, but also we don't want online gatherings and this online presence to disappear completely, because it can still be a very powerful tool for reaching those different voices, as Jim said, to get different perspectives into the conversation. And whether that's people joining a webinar like this, or whether that's being able to get a speaker from the US or a different part of the UK or Europe, these are all very helpful things that the move online has been beneficial for in the interfaith world. And I think that's a really helpful thing that we should continue to keep in mind as we come out of this pandemic.
Just briefly on that, and thanks for your questions, Andrew. And Andrew's been a massive help to me in particular as I've sort of navigated this project. So thank you for all of your input and support. I think just echoing what Jim and Austin have said, I think one thing that when we were having these initial conversations about how we would frame this research, there was very much this idea that there's this intergenerational divide and people are worried about it in interfaith. And actually what we found was quite positive in that, and I know, Andrew, you were present at our youth conference, that more established interfaith leaders, they do want young people to be involved, and actually young people do want to learn. So that in itself, as a concept, there's space there. And I think, so, I know we only did one intergenerational conference, but something online where you can bring these two groups together and have those conversations. And I think there's something to be said of the online space as empowering young people. And I think they might be more likely to have asked difficult questions of authority figures in that online space, as opposed to sort of sitting down with you. So I think, I think that online space could be a way to, one, increase inclusivity, secondly, increase intergenerational dialogue, but also break down those traditional kind of structures of authority that are more salient, I think, when you're in the room with somebody. So I think doing more stuff like that will open this up much more.
Disha's made a very good point in the chat about the kind of sort of equality that Zoom creates. And we actually heard this from some of our participants, that when you're in a room, there's always a kind of, well, who gravitates to the front and who sits at the back? Whereas on Zoom, it's kind of everyone's there, everyone's got equal kind of sort of status and ability to participate. That was something I remember one of our respondents raising. Other questions or comments, reflections on experience? Suzanne?
Yeah, just on that point, but that wasn't my question. I was doing some research myself for my PhD into gender and interfaith and inclusion during the pandemic, and I was supposed to do participant observation. Obviously wasn't possible, and my supervisors were saying, well, can you do something online instead? And just a few tester observations showed me that I couldn't, because the things that I would be looking for, like we were just saying, in terms of deference, where people gather, who is at the front, how much time people are given to speak, all of those things were just not the same. It was much more equal online, and so I couldn't do my research like that, and had to not do with participant observation and just stick to the interviews. But I did have a question about a methodological question about what proportion of the young people of your participants were university students compared to, and I was just thinking about education levels and whether you notice anything about education levels in terms of participation and inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's a really good question. So most of our participants were university educated, most of them, not all of them. And I think for a project of this size, we were always mindful that that particular going to university in itself gives you a unique perspective, I think, on like meeting people and making friends and having those difficult conversations about different ways of thinking. So although I think the thing to take away from our sampling is that certainly we can say that having a university education and being in London does perhaps give those young people an advantage in all of this. And I think we've been very mindful in the way that we've framed our conclusions and recommendations and our analyses to kind of, I think, appropriately give note to that limitation. And I think in the future, we will certainly investigate these issues in a broader sample. And that's why we did our online survey as well. So our qualitative interviews were mostly university educated young people, but our online survey allowed us to explore these questions in a wider population. And the online survey questions and the qualitative interview questions were consistent. So we were looking at data, the two data streams, but we were looking at the thematic concerns, their consistency in different ways of collecting data. So the thing that really, I think, is for me the most salient finding is the way that personal contact really does shape young people as ability to understand, to keep global conflicts outside of their kind of immediate social networks. And again, you know, arguably young people that go to university are more likely to have a broader network, not always, but more likely. So I think we will like to examine these conclusions in a wider population as the research unit sort of progresses, and have more active engagement in those harder to reach communities. But those of us that do this research, I think it's difficult. I think you ask these questions and only a certain type of young person is going to want to take this survey or be interviewed. And I think the challenge for us as researchers is to incorporate that into the way that we write up our research, so that we're mindful of these limitations. And we certainly haven't sought to, generalize or essentialize our conclusions to a wider population, but say that in this particular set of young people, when we've triangulated all the data, this is the most consistent thing. But we do hope that in the future we can, especially get out there as well. I'm very keen to get out there and do research with different communities. It's what I've always done. And hopefully we can bring more young people into the conversation. But certainly our online survey made it more diverse.
Thanks, Suzanne. Any further questions? Disha, back to you.
I just have one that's kind of a logistical question, I think. Where does this report go? What do you do with it now?
That's a good question. We're thinking about a few opportunities. We particularly want to work with some of the faith leaders within London. So talking to the Diocese of London about working with organizations across different faiths to run some kind of faith leader training. We need to find some kind of policy seminar where we can get the recommendations that we've made about what government should be doing heard by government. And then we're really looking for other opportunities where people think that it would be helpfully received and discussed, to let us know. Mamit, have you got thoughts on what next? It's sort of like we've just produced it and now we're kind of recovering and thinking about what to do with it.
Yeah, I think all of that. I think we want, this research is different in a way to any sort of research I've done as a researcher before, because it's been more collaborative in the sense. I remember Disha talking to you right at the beginning and saying, Disha, what do we need to look at, and having that similar conversations with Andrew. So we want to maintain those links, and we want this report to get as broadly circulated to people that it might help. But we also want to take this work forward. We don't want it to stop here. We are committed to sort of this sector, these issues, and particularly the global and the local. When we were doing this work and, I was speaking to different people, this idea of the way that the global is impacting social cohesion at the local level for young people is something that requires our attention. And particularly that finding I will be taking forward hopefully in the next year and examining that in different contexts. So examining that, I remember speaking to Andrew about this in the Midlands and in different parts of the country where intra-group contact and diversity takes different forms and different compositions. So from an academic perspective, that's what we hope to be taking forward. But for the purposes of this report, we want to just keep getting this message out there, but also for you to keep informing us about what's useful and what we can continue to look at.
Further questions or shared experiences? Particularly keen to hear from those of you who are working within interfaith organizations, whether you recognize the things that we've said, and perhaps particularly reflecting on challenges of recent weeks with the global tensions impacting on local communities. I know that it's been quite difficult for a lot of interfaith organizations, and we very much hope that this research is going to help people explore that. And our recommendation around auditing resilience in an organization seems to me to be something quite new, and one that we've just begun to think about, and we would welcome kind of conversations about what exactly that needs to address.
I think I will just add, I mean, I think the tensions do end up spilling over because, like, for example, we're part of a WhatsApp group in my interfaith organization, and there have been conversations where someone has had to interject and say, look, you know what, let's just stick to the business that we're currently dealing with, because this is stuff that's going on somewhere else, and we're bringing in stuff that's political into different discussions. And it's never helpful, but equally there are things that need to be said. It's like we actually need to have it out to move forward. And at the moment, we're not doing that. At the moment, because of everything else that's happening, we're just brushing it under the carpet. But there's a point at which it will become very problematic. So, we are going to have to thrash it out and say, okay, what do we really feel about what's going on in Israel, Palestine? So as I said before, that level of dialogue, what does it look like, and how do we make it happen? But it does need to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yes, risk of taking too much time, but if others have got things to add. But I think you're absolutely right. This global local thing is really kind of sharp on so many issues, and we see this here in Birmingham a lot, whether it's the farmers' protest in India and kind of how that's kind of playing out here, or Israel Palestine. I mean, just one thing that we did recently, I've put in the chat that through the charity I lead called The Feast, that works with young people, again slightly younger than the research that you did. It's kind of school age, secondary school age. We're doing monthly online meetings for young people, but also for adults who work with young people. And it's global. We have folk from here, from the States, from Egypt, Latvia, and a few other places. And if folk want to find out more about it, do ask me in the chat and I can send you all the details. Really interesting. We meet once a month, but we recently a request for from one of the young people to address the issue of Israel-Palestine. We led a couple of sessions, but it was led by Solutions Not Sides, who I would commend to people to tackle difficult topics like this. They did it brilliantly, but because we're online, they were able to bring on an Israeli and a Palestinian peace activist who are in Israel and Palestine into the call with us, and that was it worked really well. Partly it was the intergenerational stuff. So the youngest person was, I think we got a young interfaith activist from Florida who's running an interfaith club in his school in Florida, and one of our patrons, Beverly, she's in her 60s, a businesswoman from here in Birmingham. But we also, the young people are engaging with a rabbi from Chicago, a Christian from Upper Egypt, who have very different takes on what the Israel-Palestinian conflict means for them. And I think that's what, as you said, one of the advantages of doing it online was it brought in a whole load of voices that if we'd done it in person, we'd have never been able to include. And so it was a good place where the global local thing impacted, as we've said, but the use of doing it online created a space. And actually, yes, if we're in a room, that conversation might have been deeper in some ways, but doing it online does give that sense of equality. We're all in the same size little box. It's much easier to kind of manage how the conversation works. So it worked really well, but certainly Solutions Not Sides is a group I would really commend to you if you're interested in that. They're really good.
Thanks, Andrew. And I think it's interesting. We've obviously talked a lot about how the global is shaping the local. I think part of what you've pointed out there is something we've also observed, which is that local conversations on global situations can also lack perspectives. And what we've had the opportunity for through online gathering, and Suzanne's put in the chat the example of the Rossing Centre, who had a seminar recently on the impact of interfaith of the Israel-Palestine conflict on interfaith, is actually hearing from people more engaged in the conflict, trying to engage in interfaith, in that context, or people in simply other parts of the world who see things slightly differently. And it's amazing how much kind of conversation about global issues can become quite parochial in its own kind of way. We've got time for a final question or comment, if anyone would like to make it. In which case, it just remains for me to thank you all for coming. We have sent you the report, so I hope you'll have the opportunity to take a look at it. We will have some hard copies if you prefer to receive one. So just drop us an email if you'd like us to send us one or more hard copies. And as we've said, what we're looking for beyond this is opportunities for sharing the findings and building the conversation. So if those opportunities within your organizations or networks present themselves, then don't hesitate to get in touch with us. But thanks for taking this time with us today, and stay in touch with the Faith Centre and Religion Global Society at the London School of Economics.